Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, The Art and the Science of the Business Story. This is one of my favorite aspects of coaching, of workshopping, of teaching people to do public speaking, the ability to tell a story, and it's really powerful. But one of the things that I have to keep couching the content in, that this is the business story we're talking about. So I'm not talking about a bedtime story. I'm not talking about just telling a story or making up a fable. I'm talking about creating a point. So Chris, I'm hoping your microphone is working and you can hear me. If not, there is on your registration email that came back, you can dial in through the telephone. It's a free line. You dial the number and there is a PIN. And Chris, if your microphone's not working, I do record these webinars, so please send me an email and I can send you a recording of the webinar early next week. It takes me a while to get the webinar recorded. Moving on, how to participate in webinars. Please ask questions as we go. Make comments. Type into the question box, how does this apply to yourself? How can you use this in the future? Have you used storytelling in the past? Have you told the wrong kinds of stories? Can you sharpen your storytelling? Have you not given storytelling any thought? And have you remained on the facts, the data, the information, the case studies to illustrate your points? And how can you apply this information that I'm going to share with you today to your next presentation? We all have a story to tell, and I want you to start to think about how can you incorporate storytelling. Storytelling is how we advocate change, how we educate people, how we create memorable messages, how we put forward the idea of change, how it can become more influential, or put forward new ideas with the idea of promoting new thinking, challenging, even putting forward the idea of disruption. And we've all heard of Uber and Airbnb. Whether you like them or not, they are disruptive models of business. And within disability fields, within health fields, there's new ways of doing things. And how do you educate people and influence people and open their minds to your way of thinking? Powerful stories is one of the ways you can do this. So why tell stories? And here's some science behind the storytelling. This comes from Stanford University in the United States, and I've read other studies as well, some work from Malcolm Gladwell. If I just talk to you, so let's blank your screens, no handouts, no PowerPoint, apparently 5 to 10% of the people will recall what I've said in a week's time. If I talk to you, the retention rate's 10% at best. That means 9 out of 10 of you on this webinar will not remember what I've said in a week's time. Let's bring the PowerPoint back. Let's do some handouts. I'll go to the flip chart and write on the whiteboard. I've tripled the retention rate to 30%. However, 7 out of 10 are still going to not get the message. They're going to forget or not remember what I've spoken about. If I throw in a story, an anecdote that creates emotion, creates an emotional journey, highs and lows, creates a visceral response, a gut, a heart-held response, then the retention rate goes up to 75%. That's why we tell stories. There's a rule of thumb. People will not remember what you've said. They will remember how you have made them feel. So when you're presenting or training or educating, part of your role is to create a memorable, a visceral response. Help people see light at the end of the tunnel. Help people realize that they can do it. Help people feel, wow, this is a different way of thinking. Maybe they don't agree with it. Maybe they can't remember the 4-step process, but in their gut, they walk out of your presentation thinking, I too can do this. I now see the way forward. So part of your role is to create that visceral, that emotional response. I'm not going to remember much of what you told me, but I'm going to remember how you made me feel, is an important model to think about as you're preparing your presentations. So Chris, I see you're trying to dial in with the telephone. I've got your telephone, but it's not green. So hopefully you will get audio fairly soon. The other thing with stories and the power of stories is that they are your unique intellectual property. So you know that project that was really difficult and you were able to work forward with a successful outcome. You thought outside the box. You didn't follow the traditional methods that weren't working. You became a little bit more innovative. That's your unique intellectual property. You know, that family with a child with intellectual disabilities with complex needs that are struggling, and you worked with them. That's your unique intellectual property. You know, that project that went pear-shaped, that mistake you made, that staff member that you had conflict with and you could never resolve. It's not that you were unsuccessful. What did you learn from that experience? That is your unique intellectual property. So when trying to illustrate a point, you can go to a story. The other thing with stories, it's not written there, but I will encourage you to use stories for this reason. The thing with stories is that you know them. You don't have to write them. They're yours. You don't have to memorize them. So when I do a presentation, when I do a keynote and people say, how do you present without notes? It's because I tell stories. I tell 4 or 5 stories that I use to illustrate the point that I'm making. So that's another reason for stories. Just give me a moment. Just having problems with my slide. So that's another 2 reasons for stories. Simply to give your unique intellectual property, and you don't have to script or write or remember that story. How do you unfold your story? Quite simply, tell a story. Illustrate a point. Outline the benefits or the value of that point to the audience. And it's okay to start with the point first. So you may illustrate the point first. So you may put point, story, point, the benefits. Let me give you an example. In one of the workshops that I do, I talk about the importance of knowing your audience. I use a metaphor of walking in your audience's footsteps before you speak to them. So really important that you do your your research and you know who's in the room. Really important. Recently, I was trekking in Nepal in the Annapurna ranges. Absolutely beautiful. You've got the Himalayas in the background, snow-capped mountains, walking with my family. Absolutely amazing experience. If you haven't been to Nepal, if you haven't been to Kathmandu, you really should go. While I was in Kathmandu, people found out that I was going to be there and asked me to speak at a conference. I said yes. I volunteered my time. It wasn't paid. And I started my presentation, it was around storytelling, by saying in the room, who has heard of Steve Jobs? Who in the room's heard of Steve Jobs? Everyone in the room went. I said, come on, you must have heard of Steve Jobs. Once again, all people in the conference room, 30, 40 people went. And I said, I don't believe you. You know, the iPhone, Apple computers, you must have heard of Steve Jobs. The young man down the front bobbed his head from side to side and said, Peter, we've all heard of Steve Jobs. And of course, in Hindu, this means yes. The bobbing of the head from side to side means yes. Here I am presenting to a group of people. I've just walked on stage. I haven't done any research, background, any cultural nuances, and I'm looking like an idiot. So please, I urge you, make sure you know who's in the room. Do your research. Walk 30 moons in their moccasins. Don't presume to know your audience if you don't. And then if you do that, you'll never look like an idiot like I did when I didn't understand that these people in Kathmandu were saying, yes, we've all heard of Steve Jobs. The point, know your audience. The story, me making an idiot of myself presenting in Kathmandu. The point, know your audience. The benefits, you'll come across as more credible, you'll be more trustworthy, people will accept your point, and you'll be culturally appropriate, and you'll be able to give them a cultural compliment. So that's how you use a story. If you tell a story, it's a wonderful story. People laugh at it when I tell that story live. If I tell a story and there's no point, then I must be a stand-up comedian or some other form of entertainer. If I tell a story and I make a powerful point and there's no benefit or no value to you, then once again, I'm wasting my time. So the story must have a business point, and there must be some value to those who are listening. That's how you unroll your story. Any questions on that model? You can start straight with a story. So I want to share with you a story when I was in Kathmandu presenting. People asked me if I'd do a workshop on storytelling, and I said yes. So I started by, then I tell my story. So the point is, I didn't take the time to know my audience, and I look silly. The benefit to you guys is do your due diligence. Know who's in the room. I'm going to Victoria on Monday, and I'm going to Kerang, and I'm going to speak to some Indigenous people there, and that is Barapa country. Then later on, I'm going to Shepparton, and I'm presenting a workshop in Shepparton. That's Yorta country. And then I'm doing a workshop in Bendigo, and that's Jajarung country. This is my preparation so I don't get the wobbly heads mixed up the wrong way. I don't offend people. Important to try and relive your story rather than just retell your story. And part of trekking in Nepal is the beautiful foothills of the Himalayas, the people, the tea house trekking, the snow-capped mountains. And afterwards, the people came up to me and they nodded their head and said, Peter, that's the best presentation I've ever heard. Once again, rather than just go through the motions and tell the story, far better if you can transport yourself and relive the story to help create that emotional connection. The business story. You need your data, you need your facts. What's the story that supports that data? And that's how you create a business story. I work with the mining sector, BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto. If I tell these engineers, these mining guys, these geologists to do storytelling, they're going to kind of roll their eyes and say, look, Peter, here's the data, here's the facts. It's just black and white. We do this. We tell the people to do this. This is the overwhelming evidence. Yeah, you can do that, but if only 10% remember, or you show some data and 30% remember, 70% don't remember. So this is the business story. You need your data. You need your examples. You need your case studies. You need your research. You need your numbers, return on investment, break even. This appeals to the logic, the thinkers, the analytical people, the engineering type people. And this model is adapted from Dolan, authors by the name of Dolan and Naidu, Australian authors. I'm not saying abandon your data. I'm not saying abandon your statistics, your information, but they appeal to the thinking part of the person. Then you gather your story, your personal story, your experiences, your mistakes, your struggles, stories that support your data. I can tell you to study your audience, do your pre-workshop surveys, understand who's going to be in the room, what are their tipping points, what are their pain points. I can tell you that. This is the checklist to do before you go into a room of people. But I can also tell you the story of me being an idiot because I didn't do what I'm just telling you to do. Some of you will remember the checklist, but who's going to remember Peter talking about Steve Jobs in Kathmandu and everyone shaking their heads? And Peter looking like an idiot because he kept asking 3 times, not realizing they were all saying yes. And one young man had the courage to say, Peter, yes, we all understand. You'll remember the Kathmandu story more so than my checklist. When you combine them, this is how you inspire, persuade, engage, have impact and create memorable stories. And I love this quote from Brené Brown, the author of The Power of Vulnerability. Very good TED Talk. Those of you who watch TED Talks, Brené Brown. Maybe stories are just data with soul. You need the data, you need the information, you need to do your research, your due diligence. What story illustrates that? What story can you use to illustrate that? Let me give you another quick story which I'm going to borrow. The CEO of National Australia Bank, his name's Andrew Thorburn, wanted to get all of his CEOs, chief financial officers, chief operating officers, head branch managers, got them all together and wanted them to model the change, the new way of doing business that they were going to take out to all their branches. And he spoke to them and said, it's really important that you guys demonstrate this change, that you model the way. This is one of the keys of creating effective change management within our organization. It needs to be top and filter down. On the weekend just gone by, and as you know, I'm trying to help my son get his driver's license. So I took him out for a couple of lessons. We were driving down one of the freeways in New South Wales, and what I noticed was as he changed lanes, he would put his indicator on and it would flick once or twice and he would immediately merge and change lanes. So I spoke to him about this and I said, Stephen, This is not how you change lanes. What you need to do is you need to indicate 3 to 5 times, look over your shoulder and check that there's no cars, and then you move lanes if it's free to do so. By indicating and allowing 5 to 6 indicators, you're letting people know that you're intending to change lanes. They can slow down or speed up to create that gap for you to go in. So that's why you don't indicate once or twice and then immediately move across. And Stephen said to me, yeah, I know that, Dad, but I was just doing exactly what you do. So guys, as we go back to our branches, back to our staff, if we want them to adopt these new changes, these new strategies, we need to model the change we want them to follow. No good just telling them to do it and us doing things the wrong way. We need to model the change. So his story, his point is you need to model. His story is that his son followed what he was modeling, which was wrong in changing lanes. He was a sloppy driver. So we in the banking sector need to do the same thing. Data versus story. Combine, they inspire, they engage. We won't remember so much your 5-step process, your rationale, your break-even point, but we'll remember the story that illustrates why we need to do this new change. Where do you get your stories from? In reality, they're everywhere. Those mistakes you make, the people you meet, the problems you solve, the problems you don't solve, the unexpected events, everyday life. Stories are everywhere. One of the presentations, one of the keynotes I give is about courage. And one thing about courage is fear doesn't go away. The courage is still there. The fear is still there. Courageous people are those people who push through fear. And one of the things that I talk about is you need to have a positive mindset. And what would the positive self-talk say when something, I guess, adverse or a challenge pops up? And people that are not courageous go for the negative, you know, why me? It's not fair. They go into the victim mentality. And I tell a story about my new granddaughter. And when she was first brought home, she was a little bit premature, so we had a child care nurse visit every day. And one day the nurse was weighing my daughter and she weed all over her, all down her uniform, wet, saturated. The child health nurse's response was fantastic, absolutely brilliant. Samantha, you are doing a fantastic job. This baby is getting lots of fluid. They're putting on weight. Their kidneys are working. This is the best outcome I could have expected for this little girl. As she walks out of my daughter's house, saturated in baby urine. Wow, what a positive spin to put on what someone else might have said, damn. Stories are everywhere. Stories are everywhere. I use that story to just demonstrate how one professional puts a positive spin on something that might be negative. So the marketer's job, according to Seth Godin, and you guys, when you're giving lessons, when you're talking about health and safety, when you're talking about change, reducing budgets, new policies, your marketing, you're selling information, the marketer's job is to tell a true story, one that resonates, one that matters to people, and to repeat it often enough that it creates value for those people listening to it. That's the power of the business story. The science is people are going to remember your message. If you don't tell stories, only 10 to 30% of the people are going to recall what you've said. Just before we wrap up, and I've still got a few minutes to go, so I'm going to give you a little bit more at the end. I've got a whole host of workshops coming up in Melbourne, in rural Victoria, in Bendigo, workshops in Perth, and workshops in Queensland towards the end of the year. Next webinars in August, the importance of eye contact when presenting and how to use the platform when presenting. You can look at those on my website. 6 mistakes when telling stories. So this is the quick 5-minute just to add on to the end of that storytelling bit. And just before I go on, are there any questions on the storytelling model that I've revealed to you? We know why to tell stories, and the model is tell a story, make a point, outline the value, and gather stories anywhere. If the CEO of NAB Bank can use storytelling, then why can't we? Sharon, just type your question in the dialog box, please. Or you want me to open your microphone? You've got your hand up, Sharon, so I assume you have a question. Sharon? No, hands down. Okay. Just type the question in if you have any. Just as I wrap up and type those questions in. First mistake, not using your own personal stories. Borrowing other people's stories. So much better when you can use your lived experience. I use the National Australia Bank story purely to illustrate that other executives, financial, technical, highly paid people use stories. I don't know much about Andrew Thorburns' story. I've heard it secondhand from the person who coached him. So if you guys as an audience ask me about the story, teaching his son to drive, I can't answer it. The Kathmandu story is my story. My granddaughter's story is my story. You can ask me about those and I can give you answers. So try to use your own stories as opposed to borrowing other stories all the time. Sometimes you need to borrow other stories to put a bit of credibility in. Not letting the audience know in advance, just moving into a story. So please say, look, I just want to share a story with you. Let me show you a story that illustrates the point. That reminds me of a story. Question just answered. Thanks, Sharon. Mistakes, using the wrong story for the wrong audience. I call this framing. You may have gathered from some of the things I've said. I work with health professionals. I work with disability professionals. I work with mining and oil and gas. I don't use my disability stories with the oil and gas. They kind of don't connect as well with the engineers and the geologists and the health and safety aspect. The next mistake, and Chris, I've got your question. I'll get back to your question. The next mistake is using old stories. Have you heard the story about the tortoise and the hare? Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach him how to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Try and keep fresh stories. Making yourself the hero. Some of our stories we come through and we are the success, but make your audience the hero. You are not the hero, even though it's your story and maybe you solve the problem, maybe you save someone's life. What is the point? And make it about the audience. And the last mistake is having to explain your story. You know when someone tells you a joke and no one laughs and they then have to explain the punchline? If people don't get your story, then it's not a good story to use. So Chris, I have no good stories to share that can relate to the presentations. How do you find meaningful personal stories? I'm hoping that, and let me toggle back, somewhere there's something in your life that illustrates a point. The other way of looking at it is when we go to job interviews and we address criteria or skills, we go into storytelling. This job requires interpersonal skills. Give me an example of when you've used your interpersonal skills to resolve conflict. This job needs project management. Give me an example of a project that you've managed that you struggled to manage because of insufficient information. So what point are you trying to make? And if it's about modeling the way, then Andrew Thorburn used an example of when he was teaching someone, his son, and he didn't model the way and the consequences. Really, stories are everywhere. Chris, I'd love to spend more time and talk to you one-on-one. You've got my mobile phone number. Just give me a call afterwards. I'll be quite happy to talk to you and maybe do some brainstorming with you around some stories. This is the 30 minutes up. Some of you have to go back to work. I don't want to spend any more time on this, but remember the power of the business story. It's the story that people remember. People are not going to remember much of what you've said. They're going to remember how you made them feel. Try and find a story that illustrates a point. What engineering, what hard fact, what scientific point are you trying to make? Come up with a story that illustrates it. A simple metaphor, a simple story. Thanks, guys. Let me know if you have any questions. Chris, do give me a call, and I'll speak to you later.